So at Tanssi, we're essentially building a protocol to facilitate the deployment of decentralized networks, or AVSs as they're better known on Eigenlayer, for example. Yeah, our goal is really to accelerate the growth of these decentralized networks, and I'll talk about that throughout the presentation. So I think we can kind of start with the premise that it's very difficult to argue against the fact that developers want their own networks, right? And since 2020, there's been a substantial amount of growth when it comes to roll-ups, application-specific roll-ups, app chains in general. I think the Cosmos SDK and Substrate were the first ones to kind of facilitate the deployment of these app chains or roll-ups. But since then, there's been a proliferation of roll-up as a service providers that have facilitated the deployment of roll-ups throughout the years, and it's become very popular in recent years. So the question is, why the growth, right? Like, why do developers want their own networks? And I think the app chain thesis, the roll-app thesis is well known at this point. One of the biggest arguments that we see is this idea of sovereignty, right? When you're building on a public shared chain such as Ethereum, you're essentially sharing block space with all other developers that are building in that ecosystem, right? Building your own network gives you sovereignty, right? You have dedicated block space that is desirable for many reasons, right? Governance is one of them, right? Like, you can govern the evolution of your own network. You have dedicated block space. So it just depends on the use case, but there's a lot of trade-offs involved. Customizability is another big one, right? Obviously, you can't, if you're a developer, you can't just customize Ethereum as you please based on the use case that you're building. Whereas if you have your own chain or your own network, you have like full freedom to customize that network based on what you're building, right? And that's very desirable for a lot of builders. You can improve the UX that way. So we see this as another driving kind of force. And then the economics, right? A lot of the teams that we speak to, they're very much attracted by the idea of giving their token more utility, right? And more value capture. Because you use it for security, for paying for fees, for staking, for governance. You can implement it as the underlying gas token of the chain as well. So this is arguably one of the biggest reasons why we're seeing demand for kind of sovereign networks, is this kind of value capture and economics component. But yeah, like with everything, there's trade-offs, right? I think roll-ups are great. They've gotten a ton of traction in recent years, but they come with a lot of trade-offs. Perhaps the most obvious one that everybody here knows is centralization, right? A lot of these roll-ups rely on a single sequencer to order all the transactions. I think this is a problem that's actively being worked on. It's kind of in conflict with the principles of Web3, right? This idea of centralization. There's single points of failure. There's censorship. The sequencer kind of can decide which transactions to include and which not. And I think with the pending kind of pressure of regulation, this is going to become increasingly important, right? Like, what protocols are actually resilient and unstoppable if they were to be pressured, right? And I think nobody really cares about this topic until something happens. And I think we're going to see this become more and more relevant in the years to come, particularly with the growing regulatory concerns. Another big one is EVM only, right? So while you can customize rollups to a certain extent, they mainly service EVM only deployments. So the customizability is a bit limited, right? And the EVM is great. It's gotten a ton of traction, but it's not the best suited for like every use case, right? Like for some things it's simply inefficient. You just can't build it in an EVM, like a storage protocol or bridges. I mean, there's a bunch of use cases that you can talk about that are just not suited for an EVM. Fragmentation is another obvious one. Like the proliferation of roll apps and app chains in general have fragmented the ecosystem. It's fragmented liquidity. The user experience becomes a lot more challenging. The developer experience as well. So this has been a significant problem as well. And poor finality, right? Optimistic rollups in general have pretty poor finality properties. So it takes, there's a fraud-proof period of a week. Optimism hasn't really deployed fraud-proof for a while. I don't know, they're actively working on it. I don't know if it's live yet, but yeah, this is also a problem, right? Considering cross-chain, how cross-chain has become more and more popular, the problem with finality is that the more you send messages and transactions between chains, if you have poor finality, you're just kind of imposing longer and longer waiting periods on the end user, which makes for a bad user experience, right? So a lot of developers that we speak to, they really care about having quick finality. So yeah, these are just some of the things that we've observed with the current landscape in terms of trade-offs. Enter, restaked networks, AVSs, networks in general, however you want to call them. I know that, Symbiotic, Eigenlayer have different terminology. The idea here is that you can kind of extend an application's use case beyond the EVM, right, while retaining the shared security that Ethereum has to offer. This is one of the most attractive reasons why developers build rollups to begin with, right, because you inherit the security of Ethereum without having to bootstrap your own validator set. So this kind of allows you to build pretty much any service or use case that you can think of while still leveraging kind of Ethereum's validator set, which is incredibly valuable because it's just going to broaden and open a new design space in the years to come for decentralized services in general. So that's great. You can leverage Ethereum security. Customizability is a huge one, right? Like, you're no longer limited to what the EVM can provide. Things like storage protocols, bridges, app chains, DA layers, oracles. There's a lot of use cases that are now possible to be built while leveraging the security of Ethereum. Decentralization is another big one, right? You're no longer limited to just a single sequencer, which can be problematic for Web3 applications. And then fast finality. Like I said before, this is another problem that we're seeing with developers that they really care about, and you can now kind of deploy networks that can settle transactions or messages like in seconds rather than days or weeks. But I think decentralized networks, restake networks, AVSs, they're very nascent, right? So we're seeing very similar patterns to what we already saw in the past. The infrastructure around these networks or AVSs is very lacking. So to begin with, teams have the responsibility, while you can still leverage Ethereum security, you still have the responsibility of having to recruit validators or operators to opt into your network, right, or to your AVS. And that just takes time, right? You have to go out and speak to them, convince them that what you're building is worth validating or that your token is going to be valuable. So this just takes time, effort, resources to go about doing this, right? Then after you kind of secure these validators, you have to actually attract like restaked value to your AVS, right? So yet again, this is another friction point where you need to take care of. The team needs to deal with it. And most teams, you're just taking away time from actually building the application that developers want to build to begin with, right? So again, it just takes more time and more energy. Protocol primitives, right? You need to handle how are you going to take care of DA, block production, validation, then all the tooling that's necessary, right? Like if you're building decentralized networks, you'll probably need wallets, indexers, oracles, bridges, RPC endpoints. So there's all this kind of complementary tooling that is inherent with building a network that, again, it just takes time to like integrate these things. You're not going to build them yourself because some of these things are projects in and of themselves. So just building these kind of partnerships is extremely time consuming. And yeah, things like cross-chain communication, implementing governance models for decentralized networks is actually like extremely complex, right? So all of these things just add to the time to market, right? It's going to take you months to kind of put all these things together. And what developers want to do is that they want to go to market quickly, right? They want to deploy, they want to focus their energy and their resources on the actual application layer, the application that they're building. And I think, yeah, these are like very obvious problems that are being worked on, and this is essentially what we're trying to solve with Tanssi, right? Like, at the end of the day, Tanssi is kind of a protocol that abstracts away all this infrastructural complexity associated with deploying decentralized networks, right? We're working with Symbiotic on this restaking protocol. So how it's going to work is Tanssi itself is going to be a network or a chain. It's going to connect to Symbiotic to attract restaked value. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to enable the deployment of networks or AVSs, right? So you can kind of think of it as a network or an AVS to deploy other AVSs. And we do this by providing, block production as a service and validation as a service. So what we're going to do is we're going to do all the work that I mentioned before. So we're going to recruit all the validators, the operators to opt into our network. We're going to attract the restaked value. And then we're going to allow developers to kind of leverage our network to launch their own networks. So the idea with this is that, again, we're just kind of removing these friction points. And then we're also working with a lot of like tools and partners, right? Like what I mentioned before, the wallets, the oracles, indexers, bridges. The idea is to kind of automate the integration path of all these things within the developer experience so that developers don't have to go out and take care of all these components themselves. So yeah, this is kind of the broad idea with Tanssi, and we're utilizing Substrate, which is a highly like modular and customizable tech stack, which is very aligned with the value proposition of AVSs, right? This idea of customizability. And yeah, the overarching goal is really, deploy in minutes, not months, without compromising on decentralization and security, which are values and principles that are extremely important to us. So yeah, that's kind of at a high level how it looks like. This is just kind of an overview of some of the teams that we're working with. We deployed a testnet several months ago. You know, we've had over 2,000 networks deployed on that testnet. So we are getting traction. We're working with teams ranging from, you know, gaming, RWA projects, DeFi, SocialFi. So the verticals are quite broad in terms of what we're attracting. And now really the objective of the team is to deploy mainnet. So we're actively working with Symbiotic to deploy something in Q1 of next year. So that's really the main objective right now. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you guys want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to us on Telegram, Twitter. We're very available. So yeah, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but that's pretty much it from my side. Thanks a lot.